When I pulled out of my driveway that Thursday morning, I wasn't thinking about lawsuits, property surveys, or county records. I was thinking about cattle prices, a worn-out trailer tire that probably needed replacing, and whether the rain forecast for the weekend would finally give my north pasture a break. I figured I'd be gone 2 days, maybe a little longer if the auction in Pine Ridge ran late. Before I left, I did what I'd done 1,000 times over the years. I walked out to the old red barn sitting on the northern edge of my ranch, rested my hand against the weathered wood, and stood there for a minute. Folks who didn't grow up on land like this probably would have seen an old building ready to collapse. I saw my grandfather's fingerprints. He built that barn in 1951 with lumber hauled in on flatbed trucks after the war. My dad learned to rope calves inside it. I learned how to swing a hammer there before I was tall enough to reach the workbench without standing on a bucket. Every faded board, every rusty hinge, every crooked nail had a story attached to it, and every time I looked at it, it reminded me that some things are worth keeping even when the world keeps telling you newer is better. My ranch covered just over 70 acres of rolling pasture outside the little town of Millstone. It had been in my family longer than I'd been alive. About 8 years earlier, developers bought the neighboring farmland and turned it into one of those polished subdivisions with matching mailboxes, perfectly trimmed lawns, decorative streetlights, and enough HOA rules to make people afraid to leave a garbage can out 5 minutes too long. We never really mixed. They stayed behind their entrance sign with its fake stone pillars, and I stayed behind my fences with my cattle, my horses, and my peace and quiet. At least, that was the arrangement I thought we had. 2 days later, I came home tired, dusty, and ready for nothing more exciting than a hot shower and a quiet evening. I turned off the county road, drove through my front gate, and immediately spotted something that didn't belong. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the bright yellow paper nailed right into the front of my grandfather's barn. I slammed the truck into park before the engine had even stopped running. Whoever put that notice there hadn't bothered with tape or string. They'd driven 2 nails straight through the paper and into 75 years of family history like they were hanging a garage sale sign. I yanked it off so hard one of the nails bent sideways. The headline read, "Unauthorized structure." The next line ordered the removal of the building within 30 days under Evergreen Hills HOA zoning authority. I actually laughed for a second because it sounded so ridiculous my brain refused to accept it. Then I kept reading, and my stomach tightened. According to the paperwork, the HOA had filed documents claiming the barn stood inside their community boundaries and occupied land under their authority. They weren't asking questions. They weren't requesting clarification. They'd already convinced someone at the county that my barn belonged on their parcel map. I looked across my fence toward the subdivision and couldn't help shaking my head. There was at least 50 feet between my fence line and where that barn stood, maybe more. You could have parked a couple pickup trucks side by side in that gap. Yet somehow somebody had managed to submit paperwork saying otherwise. I walked around the barn in silence, running my fingers over the old cedar boards where my grandfather had carved his initials decades earlier. I could almost hear him laughing if he'd seen that notice. He would have probably said, "Paper doesn't move dirt, son." He would have been right. Except nowadays, paper can cause a whole lot of trouble before the truth catches up. That evening, my neighbor Walt stopped by after seeing my truck parked near the barn. He looked at the yellow notice lying on the workbench and let out a long whistle. "They're getting bold," he muttered. I asked him if he'd ever heard of an HOA trying to claim land outside its subdivision. He chuckled once. Then his face turned serious. "I've heard of boards acting like they own the county. Never seen one dumb enough to fake a boundary line." That sentence stayed with me all night. I barely slept. I wasn't scared they'd actually tear the barn down. I knew where my property lines were. What bothered me was the nerve it took for someone to walk onto my land, nail that notice into my family's history, then drive away believing they could bully me into accepting it. By sunrise, my frustration had settled into something calmer, something my father used to call dangerous patience. Anger makes you shout. Patience makes you collect evidence. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, unlocked the old filing cabinet in my office, and started pulling out documents that hadn't seen daylight in years. Original deeds, survey maps, tax records, handwritten notes from my grandfather. If someone wanted to play games with paperwork, they had picked the wrong ranch to try it on. By 8 o'clock, I was pulling into the county administration building with a banker box full of records riding in the passenger seat like it was carrying gold. In a way, it was. Every survey, every deed, every tax receipt represented decades of proof that my family had owned that land long before anyone had ever dreamed of building evergreen hills. I wasn't interested in yelling at anybody behind the counter because, as my father used to say, the clerk isn't the one who caused your problem. They're usually the one who can fix it if you give them a reason to care. A young woman named Melissa greeted me with a polite smile that slowly disappeared once I explained why I was there. She asked for the parcel number, typed for a few seconds, then frowned. "That's strange," she whispered almost to herself. She turned her monitor slightly away from me and studied something on the screen before asking if I had copies of my original survey. I smiled, opened the box, and laid out documents one by one across the counter until there wasn't an empty inch left. Some pages were older than either of us, their edges yellowed with time, but every one carried official seals, signatures, and recording numbers dating back generations. Melissa excused herself and disappeared into a supervisor's office. 10 minutes later, she returned with 2 more employees and an older survey technician whose reading glasses seemed permanently attached to the end of his nose. None of them spoke much while they compared maps. They traced boundary lines with their fingers, checked recording dates, flipped through digital records, then back to the originals sitting in front of them. Finally, the survey technician leaned back, rubbed his forehead, and quietly said, "These don't match." He wasn't talking about my paperwork. Mine matched perfectly. He was talking about what the HOA had submitted. Somebody had attached a revised parcel sketch showing the northern boundary shifted just far enough to include my barn. It wasn't a simple measuring mistake. Whoever created it had conveniently ignored decades of recorded surveys. Melissa looked genuinely embarrassed. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I don't think this should have been approved." I appreciated her honesty more than an apology. Within an hour, the demolition notice had been officially suspended pending review, and by lunchtime, the county attorney's office had opened an investigation into possible fraudulent filings. I should have driven home feeling victorious, but something kept bothering me. People willing to fake one property line usually don't stop at one. As I gathered my papers, the survey technician stopped me near the door. "Off the record," he said quietly, "if I were you, I'd pull the subdivision's original development plats. Sometimes shortcuts have a funny way of coming back years later." He gave me a small grin, then walked away before I could ask another question. That sentence echoed in my head the whole drive home. Instead of celebrating, I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in front of my computer digging through public records. Most people have no idea how much information counties make available if you're patient enough to read it. Development applications, engineering reports, easements, drainage plans, utility maps, environmental studies. It was all there, buried beneath thousands of pages. By evening, my eyes hurt and my coffee had gone cold. But then I found something interesting. The subdivision's original survey had been completed nearly a year before construction started. A revised version appeared 6 months later with minor adjustments to road locations and drainage easements. Then there was another revision after the clubhouse had already been built. That caught my attention. Buildings are usually designed around property lines, not the other way around. I downloaded every file I could find and spread printed copies across my dining room table. Around midnight, Walt stopped by carrying 2 burgers from the diner because he'd figured I hadn't eaten. He looked at the mountain of maps covering the table and laughed. "Looks like you're planning an invasion." "Maybe just an excavation," I answered. He pulled up a chair, and together we started comparing surveys. Walt had spent 30 years laying pipeline before retiring, so reading engineering drawings came naturally to him. About 20 minutes later, he tapped one page with his finger. "Hold on," he muttered. I leaned closer. The clubhouse foundation on one survey didn't quite line up with the legal boundary shown on another. The difference looked tiny at first glance, just a narrow strip hardly anyone would notice. Then we checked the measurement scale. 6 feet. The clubhouse, the decorative courtyard, part of the pool deck, and even a section of the tennis court crossed 6 feet onto my ranch. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Walt leaned back and started laughing so hard he nearly dropped his burger. "They tried stealing your barn," he said between laughs, "and they've been parking their $1 million clubhouse on your land this whole time." I laughed too, but only for a moment. Then reality settled in. If those surveys were accurate, this wasn't just embarrassing for the HOA. It was expensive. Very expensive. The next morning, I hired an independent licensed survey company with no connection to the county or the subdivision. I wanted fresh measurements nobody could challenge. 3 surveyors arrived carrying GPS equipment that looked more suited for NASA than ranch work. They spent nearly 2 full days locating old iron markers buried beneath grass, checking elevation points, comparing satellite coordinates, and measuring every corner of the disputed boundary. I stayed out of their way, watching from the porch with a cup of coffee while they quietly did their job. On the second afternoon, the lead surveyor walked over holding a clipboard. "Well," he said with a tired smile, "your grandfather knew where to build fences." I asked what he meant. He turned the clipboard toward me. Every measurement confirmed the original family survey almost perfectly. The barn hadn't moved an inch outside my property. The clubhouse, however, sat exactly where those public records suggested. 6 feet inside my ranch. Not approximately. Not close enough. 6 feet. He looked at me carefully before adding, "You might want to speak with an attorney before anyone else." I already had one in mind. Nathan Brooks had handled agricultural property cases for nearly 25 years and understood one simple truth about rural landowners. We usually don't sue unless somebody leaves us no other choice. After reviewing every document, Nathan leaned back in his chair and smiled the way surgeons probably smile before easy operations. "They're in trouble," he said. "Real trouble." We filed a formal encroachment complaint, attached certified survey reports, historical deeds, aerial photographs, tax records, and requested immediate removal of every unauthorized structure extending onto my property. Nathan also sent a certified demand letter to the HOA board, giving them the opportunity to resolve the matter voluntarily before litigation expanded. 2 mornings later, I was repairing a fence when a black luxury SUV rolled slowly up my driveway. The woman climbing out looked exactly like someone who believed expensive sunglasses automatically won arguments. She introduced herself as Victoria Lang, president of the Evergreen Hills Homeowners Association. She smiled politely, but it never reached her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I'm sure this has all been one unfortunate misunderstanding." I leaned against the fence post and waited. She continued, "The board would appreciate it if you withdrew your complaint before unnecessary legal expenses get out of hand." "Funny," I replied. "I was about to suggest the same thing to you." Her smile disappeared. "Surely you don't expect us to demolish a community clubhouse over a technical issue." I looked past her toward the distant building sitting proudly above the subdivision. Families were swimming in the pool. Someone was playing doubles on the tennis court. Children were riding bicycles nearby, completely unaware of the conversation happening on my driveway. "You expected me to tear down a 75-year-old barn over paperwork you filed," I said calmly. "Why would your building deserve different treatment?" Her voice sharpened instantly. She warned me about expensive lawsuits, endless appeals, influential board members, and how difficult life could become if I insisted on pushing forward. I let her finish without interrupting. When she finally paused, I asked one question. "Victoria, before your board filed those fake boundary documents, did any of you actually hire a surveyor?" She hesitated just long enough to answer without speaking. I nodded once. That's what I thought. Then I handed her a copy of the independent survey and the court filing already stamped by the clerk. She glanced at the first page, then the second, and all the confidence drained from her face. For the first time since this whole mess had started, I realized something important. She hadn't driven out to negotiate because they thought they would win. She had driven out because they had finally figured out they were already losing. The hearing finally arrived about 6 weeks later, and if you've never sat inside a county courtroom during a property dispute, let me tell you something. It's a lot quieter than television makes it look. Nobody was pounding tables or delivering dramatic speeches. It was mostly paperwork, patient questions, and people slowly realizing which side had facts and which side had confidence. Nathan had organized our evidence into neat binders thick enough to stop a door. Every document followed the next in perfect order, starting with my grandfather's original deed, continuing through decades of tax records, aerial photographs taken over the years, certified surveys, and finally the independent measurements completed only weeks earlier. The county survey technician testified first, explaining exactly how the fraudulent boundary submission conflicted with every historical record on file. Then our independent surveyor walked the judge through the GPS measurements, showing that the barn had always remained entirely on my family's property, while part of the HOA clubhouse complex extended several feet onto mine. The HOA's attorney tried arguing that the encroachment was minor and should simply be overlooked because removing the structure would create unnecessary hardship for hundreds of homeowners. The judge leaned forward and asked a question so simple the entire courtroom went silent. Did the association believe the same principle applied when it ordered Mr. Carter to remove his barn? Nobody answered. They couldn't. That silence said more than any lawyer ever could. After a short recess, the judge returned with the ruling. The demolition notice against my barn was declared invalid. The county investigation into the altered boundary documents would continue separately. As for the clubhouse, the court found that the structure had indeed been built across my property line. The HOA had two legal options: remove every encroaching portion of the development and restore my land, or negotiate a long-term lease with me under terms we both accepted. I honestly think several board members expected me to celebrate. I didn't. I just sat there quietly because, despite everything that had happened, I wasn't interested in watching an entire neighborhood lose its gathering place. The clubhouse wasn't the problem. The people who thought they could rewrite property lines whenever it benefited them were the problem. Outside the courthouse, Victoria approached me again. Only this time, there wasn't any attitude left. She looked exhausted. "What would it take?" she asked softly. I looked across the parking lot for a moment before answering. Respect would have been cheaper. We spent the next 3 weeks negotiating. My attorney insisted on protections that should have existed from the beginning. The final agreement required the HOA to lease the occupied portion of my land for $7,500 every month, assume all maintenance responsibilities, carry additional liability insurance naming me as a protected property owner, and acknowledge in writing that the land remained mine permanently. One clause mattered more than all the others. If the association ever stopped paying, violated the agreement, or attempted another fraudulent property filing, I would have the legal right to terminate the lease and require removal of every encroaching structure at their expense. They signed without changing a single word. They really didn't have another choice. These days, not much has changed around my ranch. The cattle still wander the pastures every morning. The old red barn still catches the first sunlight just like it did when my grandfather built it all those years ago. Sometimes I walk out there with a cup of coffee before the day gets busy, run my hand across those weathered boards, and think about how close somebody came to erasing a piece of my family's story with nothing more than bad paperwork and too much arrogance. Then, almost like clockwork, sometime during the first week of every month, another check arrives from the very organization that once tried to convince the county my barn didn't belong where it stood. I usually smile, deposit it at the bank, and get right back to feeding cattle. The money is nice, sure, but that's never been the part that mattered most to me. What matters is knowing that truth doesn't always win quickly. Sometimes it takes patience, old records, and a willingness to keep digging when everyone else tells you to let it go. If I'd accepted that yellow notice without asking questions, my grandfather's barn might have become another forgotten memory. Instead, it became the reason an entire HOA had to admit, in writing, that they had crossed a line they never should have touched. Every now and then someone asks whether I should have just forgiven them and walked away once the county canceled the demolition order. Maybe life would have been simpler. But then I remember those 2 nails driven into that old barn door, and I wonder how many other people would have been pushed around if nobody had finally stood up and said, "Enough." So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you had been in my boots, would you have accepted an apology after the false claim was exposed, or would you have pursued the case all the way to the courtroom like I did? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you enjoy real-world property disputes, HOA conflicts, and ordinary people standing up for what's right without backing down, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.